where do stereotypes come from? Now, while I won't attempt to fully answer this question in this short of a video, I'll describe several cognitive, neurological, and social factors that underlie our propensity to stereotype. In our next video, I'll describe several of the effects that stereotyping has on how we think and how we perceive those around us, and in future videos, we'll explore in much more depth both the causes and the effects of stereotyping using examples from many different social groups. But let's start now with a very basic definition of social categorization, which is a term that on the surface might sound similar to stereotyping, but it's actually a lot broader. For example, social categorization refers to the process by which we place people into groups based on characteristics such as gender or ethnicity. That is, grouping people into categories without necessarily making assumptions about the characteristics of those categories. That would be stereotyping. So, social categorization refers to thinking about people primarily as members of social groups rather than as individuals. So hopefully you can see the overlap and the relationship to stereotyping, but they are a little bit different. We'll talk about both in this video. Let's discuss both the causes and the effects of social categorization. So again, in this video, we're focusing on the causes. Where does social categorization come from? What guides it? How does it arise? We'll talk about that in regards to stereotyping as well toward the end of this video. And again, in our next video, we'll talk about what social categorization does. What are the advantages? Why do we think in this way? And then obviously, what are the disadvantages? But for now, let's focus on those causes. So just a little bit of terminology. First, we have primary social categories. These are categories that our brain processes first. We think about them very regularly and so on. And we can contrast this with secondary social categories, which our brains don't readily think of, or they're at least not at the forefront of our minds compared to primary ones. So there are three main primary social categories. First, we have race. Next, we have sex, male, female, and so on, and age. Now, these are called primary social categories, again, because they're processed in our brains first. And you see there's an order to it. Typically, and for most people, on average, race is first, then our brains process sex, and then our brains process age. And these are very rapid processes. In a tenth of a second, we recognize these and we categorize people on the basis of their race, sex, and age. Now, obviously, it's going to differ for some people. For some people, age is going to be really relevant to them. Maybe it's on their minds more for whatever reason. They might process that first when looking at someone else, but this is on average. And this is an automatic process. If it happens this quickly, it's not like somebody is pondering this when looking at somebody. You look at somebody and automatically you're thinking about their race, their sex, and their age. And again, these typically happen first, which is why they're primary social categories. Now, why are they primary social categories? Why are our brains wired in this way? Well, one of the reasons is because these are all three very visible social categories. Now, you can be wrong in your guess about someone's race or sex, but generally there are physical features that map onto a person's race, sex, or age, and you can do a pretty good guess about where they fall in those categories. And so because they're easily visible, we think about them very readily. In addition to being visible, these categories are processed first when we meet a new person because they're so deeply embedded in our society. We have lots of beliefs and, of course, stereotypes about these three groups here. We commonly use them as ways to describe, categorize, and make assumptions about people, and as a result, they're processed early in the brain. So let's talk a little bit more about the brain since we're on the topic. I'm just going to highlight a couple of key findings that I think are really interesting and really telling, and talk about some of the sort of underlying processes. So first, we have a finding here that relates to the amygdala. The amygdala, if you don't remember, is a part of the brain that's really important for emotion processing, especially fear. So one finding is that we have greater amygdala activation in response to seeing black faces rather than white faces. So again, there's this correlation, not causation, and it's open to interpretation. But one interpretation of this effect is that we have a greater emotional response, a greater fear response possibly, when we're looking at a person's face that's black rather than white. Again, what are the possible effects of this? We'll talk about those sorts of things in our next video, but I want you to start thinking in that way now. Why might this matter? Hopefully in this case, it's easy to see. Another finding, which is a bit more hopeful, is that implicit bias, and we'll definitely define that more specifically in a future video, and we'll talk all about that. But these sorts of biases can be overcome for people who have high executive control, which is a term that refers to your ability to plan, to think before you speak, and things like that, goal-directed behavior. So you can see hopefully how that would be important for overcoming implicit biases. This is a term that's also sometimes called executive functioning or inhibitory control, typically thought of, all three of these things are typically thought of more or less being the same. So this ability is housed in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, which is quite a mouthful. But again, if you are someone who is high in executive control, it's going to be easier for you to overcome these natural implicit biases that you have. So that's encouraging, right? Another finding that I think is really interesting, and this is the last main finding I'll talk about in regards to the brain, at least for now, is a face recognition finding. So we have an area in the brain called the fusiform face area, or the FFA, and the finding is that there's greater fusiform face area activation when you're looking at someone who shares your race, the same race as you, and you have less FFA activation when you're looking at somebody of a different race. Now, why might that matter, right? So when you're looking at someone with the same race as you have more FFA activation, which means you're more deeply processing their facial features. So you're going to be able to tell the differences between different people of your same race. You're going to be able to more be sort of attuned to facial expressions, things like that, when you're looking at someone of your same race. But when you're looking at someone of a different race, you might lose some of that information, at least as fine-tuned as it is for when you're looking at your own race. And we see that this is exacerbated when people have a pro-white racial bias and they're looking at another white person. Even greater fusiform face area activation versus people who, for example, on a pre-test after taking an implicit association test or something, we'll talk about that in a future video as well, who have shown to have a pro-white racial bias. When they're looking at somebody who's black, much less, significantly less processing, which again is problematic. You're going to see fewer differences, between races there. And this is going to relate to something we'll talk about in a future video called the outgroup homogeneity effect. I won't talk about it now for the sake of time and because it's not really the focus of the video, but keep an eye on that. Keep that in the back of your brain. So, okay, what else? Attention. Attention guides categorization in 3 different ways, and I'll go through each in turn: perceptual similarity, accessibility, and perceived threat. Let's start with perceptual similarity. So this is, just as it sounds, grouping people who are perceptually similar. So we group together, we categorize sex, race, disability, obesity, age. We categorize along these dimensions. And how does this relate to attention? Well, if you are, not perceptually similar for whatever reason, you have solo status. If you're the only member of a certain group in a given situation, like you're the only female in your philosophy class, or you're the only black student in this other class, that grabs attention, right? And that further sort of reinforces this categorization process. Next, we have accessibility, and this is the idea of accessibility, which is very common in psychology and very important for psychology. Accessibility is this idea of things that are easily accessible. They come to mind very easily. So accessible social categories are social categories that we think about a lot, that we talk about a lot, and these categories take precedence. They're more likely to guide your thinking, your behavior, and your performance. One really great example and a really sad example of an accessible category and how that takes precedence comes from a stereotype threat finding. And we'll talk about stereotype threat as well in future videos at length. So in this study, the researchers brought in a room a bunch of Asian women, okay? And they were going to take a math test. And before taking the math test, they had to fill out this demographics questionnaire. And for half of the students, at the end of that questionnaire, they said, please fill out your race. And so they would type Asian, Asian American, whatever they felt was most appropriate. For the other half, they said, please indicate your gender. So they would type male, female, whatever. So this is called a priming effect, right? We're getting people in the study to think about either their race, their Asianness, or their gender, their femininity. So we have two different identities, and there's different stereotypes associated with those identities in regards to math, and they're about to take a math test. So one identity that, a participant in the study has is that they're Asian, and a stereotype is that Asians are good at math. Another identity is that the participant is a woman, and there's a stereotype that women are bad at math. An inaccurate stereotype, by the way, but a stereotype nonetheless. And that's not from me, that's of course from psychological findings, and we'll talk about that too. So here's what the researchers found. Priming Asian women to think about their Asian identity significantly increased their scores on the math test, presumably because they were thinking about the accessible race category in this case, their Asianness, and the positive stereotypes that went with that. Whereas priming the same group of people to think about their female identity significantly decreased math scores, even though they were just as capable in math. When the category that was accessible in their mind had negative stereotypes associated with it, it harmed their ability to perform well on the test. This is how accessibility guides categorization and performance and all of that. Finally, we have perceived threat. Here's some terminology that we've seen in our last video: in-groups and out-groups, social groups that we do or don't belong to. Out-groups tend to at least be perceived as more threatening, which we'll talk about how that relates to categorization, but you can of course draw your own conclusions for now as well. Okay, so let's get to this question here. Where do stereotypes specifically come from, rather than just what guides social categorization more broadly? There's, again, all sorts of things we can talk about, like parenting and media and all sorts of things. We'll get to that. But for now, three more general processes: personal exposure, distinctive individuals and behaviors, and finally, socialization, which I'll define. First, personal exposure. So when we know relatively little about a different group, right, we rely on our experience with that group, obviously, right, which can lead to overgeneralizations, especially if you don't have a lot of experience, right? If you're basing your assumptions about the entire group just on a handful of people, that can be problematic. But let me give a more general example too. Let's say you're noticing that there are more male scientists, while you're noticing at the same time that there are more women going into nurturing fields, like more female babysitters or more female teachers or whatever. Now, this can lead to the belief that men are more intelligent, whereas women are better nurturers, right? So you're relying on your own exposure. Now, you don't know for sure. You're not giving this male scientists an intelligence test or the female babysitters a nurturing test or whatever. Again, you're overgeneralizing on the basis of what you're seeing. This is how personal exposure can lead to inaccurate stereotypes. Distinctive individuals and behaviors can lead to stereotyping as well, because typical group members are less noticeable or memorable. If you see somebody who is, typical or not doing anything weird or crazy or different, you might not think too much of it. So it, again, relates to attention. It doesn't grab your attention. Instead, often what grabs your attention are those atypical examples, the more memorable examples. And so if that's grabbing your attention, that's what you're thinking about, that may lead you to form an inaccurate stereotype about the whole group on the basis of one individual. And finally, we have socialization. Now, I remember learning about socialization in college when I was taking psychology classes, and it was never really properly defined for me. So I remember being confused about what exactly this was for so long. So I'm going to try my best to give you a succinct definition. Socialization is the process by which a person learns to adjust to society or to a group and behave in ways that society deems acceptable or that the group deems acceptable. So the process of cultural stereotypes being passed down is one example of being socialized, one example of how we're socialized. And again, this is dependent on the culture, on the society. For example, we can look at stereotypes about weight in American society versus in Hawaiian society, at least traditionally. In America, this is seen as a negative thing, and people are prejudiced and discriminate against people who are obese, and we'll have videos devoted to that in the future. But in Hawaii, again, at least historically, however, this was sort of seen as a sign of wealth and prosperity, like because you're obese, you can clearly afford to feed yourself well. And this was seen as an attractive feature of a potential mate. So the reason we see such a stark difference is because of cultural stereotypes that are transmitted from generation to generation. For example, again, through parenting, media, other sorts of processes, and we'll explore all of that in future videos.